It was Saturday, a week before Christmas, and I walked down Fifth Avenue, pushing through the bright-faced throngs, the girls in their long boots of Corrège white and Wyeth brown, the boys tousle-haired, fresh, pink, moving with long, loose strides, the crowds excited by the glitter in the windows, the pleasant clamor in the streets, and the dazzle of the lights in the fading afternoon. I walked south through the crowd, feeling part of it and not part of it, for this was a Christmas that I would not share. In 48 hours, I would be boarding a plane on a long journey that would take me to Hanoi and to a world of war that lay almost outside the margin of my perception, a world where the germinal issues of our day were being delineated in shapes and forms such as even Goya had not imagined, a world of primitive drama, new experience, new adventure, and blinding conflict. I walked through the Christmas crowds, past the excavation of General Motors to be, past the shimmering elegance of the Banque Continentale, its French tapestry and Circassian walnut, the guarantee of affluence that made the dollar sign seem gauche, past the Sherry Netherlands, with its faint aura of Chanel No. 5, past long-legged girls with short jackets of pink mutation mink, past the fountain of the Grand Army of the Republic, its jets spewing ribbons of electric light, past the great windows of the plaza, golden at tea time, past F.A.O. Schwartz and the giant pandas, the giant giraffes, the giant tigers, the Playboy Club with television eyes, the luxury of Rissolis, all tender calf and Morocco bindings, Chagall's laughing on the walls, black-haired girls with white clown faces, the golden sound floating out of Saks Fifth Avenue to halo the skaters on the Rockefeller rink. New York, New York. Christmas, 1966. Beautiful, splendid, opulent, gay. A great society Christmas, an electronic Christmas. Electronic carols by the Volunteers of America, and murmuring electronic computers totaling the new volume figures. Click, click, click. Peaceful America. Friendly America. Holiday time America. Profitable America. I walked right through the Chanel, the mink, the expensive ladies, the caroling transistors, and into the Air France office for my ticket to Paris, where a Hanoi visa was waiting. Whether there would be any Christmas for me in 1966, I could not say. Christmas Eve was raw and dark, and when I emerged from the brightly lighted lobby of the Thong Nhat Hotel, it took my eyes a moment to adjust. The city seemed deserted as we got into our Volga and started out, but suddenly I became aware that in the almost blacked-out streets there was a quickening presence of silently moving people, throngs on foot, throngs on quietly rolling bicycles, men with girls riding behind them, mothers with their babies, and dark as it was, I could see that the women were wearing silks, not the usual black sateens. I felt an air of excitement. The dark masses of people grew thicker and thicker, and finally the car was forced to halt, and we got out to find ourselves surrounded by a huge crowd moving in one direction. We were swept around a corner into a large square, a rectangle really, before the Cathedral of St. Joseph. Gray and venerable looking, the cathedral was outlined with strings of glowing light bulbs. Before it, halfway down the square, was a central island filled with flowers and shrubs. This, too, was decorated with strings of light, red, yellow, green, blue, and set among the flowers were hundreds of little Vietnamese national flags, red with gold stars. We moved ahead and came to a heavy rope barrier guarded by policemen and volunteers wearing red armbands. The barrier was not to prevent access to the square and the cathedral, but to control the crowd and enable the police to admit people in an orderly fashion. As I came up to the cathedral itself, I found that it, too, was decorated with thousands of little red Vietnamese flags and red bunting. I walked up the great steps and entered. Within, there was a blaze of lights. The pillars were festooned with oriental pine, and to the right, just off the main aisle, was a large creche, not yet illuminated. Preparations for Christmas Mass were still underway, and only a handful of people were in the pews, mostly elderly women and small children. They were being permitted to come in early to avoid the crush. In addition, there was a handful of spectators like myself, half a dozen Vietnamese officials, an Italian, who I learned was a correspondent for the communist newspaper Unita, and who was intensely interested to find this Roman Catholic observance in Hanoi, a couple of visitors from East Germany, two Russian correspondents who'd never before seen a Christmas ceremony, a very blonde and buxom young woman who, I was told, had just arrived to represent Radio Moscow, and possibly a dozen church officials, each of whom wore a little pink and blue ribbon in his buttonhole. I looked closely at the ribbons. They bore the legend, Noel, 1966. At 4:30 on a chilly Christmas morning, I found myself sitting in the dark and deserted lobby of the Thong Nhat Hotel. I shivered a little as the cold air swept in from the outside with a slow turn of the revolving door. It was, I thought, just about the hour when, as a kid, I had awakened in my icy bedroom and slithered out from under the warm covers to sneak into the parlor and see whether Santa Claus had really come and whether, after all, he'd gotten a letter about the toy train. Presently, the interpreter showed up, and we got into the car and started out through the dark streets. We were driving out of Hanoi to the south, moving down Route Nationale number 1, and the traffic thickened as we neared the outskirts of the city. It was raining lightly, and had been raining more heavily a few hours earlier. There were few lights, but I could see that we were passing through an industrial area. We fell into a long line of truck traffic, mostly big military 2.5-ton trucks turned out by the Likichev factory of Moscow, a product I was very familiar with from my long years in the Soviet Union. Every war propels some obscure city or town into the limelight, a community which has existed in respectable anonymity for hundreds of years, and now suddenly is on everyone's lips. Chance, historical accident is responsible for this. There was nothing about Guernica which would have caused anyone to predict that it would be a name to survive the fading memory of the Spanish Civil War. Coventry was an ordinary English Midlands cathedral city until it was blitzed by the Germans, and Stalingrad was a dreary Soviet industrial center before the battle. No one would have guessed in 1939 that Rotterdam would become a headline name in 1940. Before Christmas Day, 1966, I had never heard of Nam Dinh. Possibly I had read the name somewhere, but if so, I did not remember it. But after Christmas Day, 1966, I would never forget Nam Dinh. Nor, I think, would many other Americans. Nam Dinh became a catalyst, a kind of prism through which the United States bombing offensive in North Vietnam took on human dimensions. For the first time, we began to see beyond the barrier of meaningless military terminology, the banal vocabulary that turns reality into a kind of etymological stew. Nam Dinh is not much to look at. We drove down to it along Route Nationale number 1, but branched off the main highway 15 or 20 miles north of the city and veered to the east. At one point, we took a detour of several miles through paddies and small villages, traveling along a newly widened and improved road that ran for a considerable distance along the top of levees or barriers which had been thrown up to separate the endless rice fields with their ever-flowing water. The detour was necessary because a bridge was out, destroyed in an American attack only a day or two earlier. We came into Nam Dinh from the north, and almost all the streets we drove through bore signs of bomb damage. Two local officials briefed me, and from them I learned that this was a textile city of about 90,000 people, before most of them had been evacuated. They said Nam Dinh had been repeatedly subjected to United States attacks, 51 or 52 raids up to that moment, including 4 on December 23rd. There had been, I was told, American reconnaissance planes over the city during the night, and thus far on Christmas morning the alert had sounded twice. It was a center for the production of consumer goods, particularly textiles. Its large textile plant normally employed 13,000 workers, 70% of whom were women. About 10,000 residents were engaged in handicraft production. The principal industries, in addition to the big cotton textile works, were a silk mill, a fruit canning factory, a farm-to plant, a rice mill, and a cooperative which made thread. Nam Dinh might be North Vietnam's third largest city, but if this was all it produced, it hardly sounded like a prime target. The officials, including the mayor, a petite woman named Tran Tri Ton, who had been a textile worker herself, insisted that so far as they were aware, the city possessed no military objectives whatever. Of course, definitions of military objectives are apt to differ between the civilians who live in a town and the men in the plains dropping the bombs. The residents of Nam Dinh reinforced their contention that the city could not be considered an important target area by insisting that it had never been mentioned as a target of attack in a United States communique. The question whether Nam Dinh possessed significant military objectives and whether it had been mentioned in a communique later became the focus of a brush fire controversy touched off in Washington by the Pentagon. The Pentagon insisted that Nam Dinh was a formidable military objective. It possessed a railroad line, a main highway, river transshipment facilities, naval facilities, oil storage dumps, and other impressive installations. It was not correct to say it had not been mentioned as a U.S. target. By careful researching of available records, it was found that on 3 separate occasions in the spring of 1966, the name Nam Dinh had been pronounced by the United States military briefing officer in Saigon. The mentions of Nam Dinh by the briefing officer, moreover, had been so inconsequential that the name of the city had never appeared in any New York Times war dispatch out of Saigon. Like most of the military objectives which I was to see in North Vietnam, Nam Dinh seemed much more imposing in the language of a Pentagon spokesman than when viewed with the naked eye. It was not a big city. It never had been. Now, under the effects of wartime evacuation, it was largely abandoned. The textile factory, according to the officials, was still operating, but it had been hit in 19 attacks. When we drove through the battered area of the plant, it immediately became apparent that the term operating was a euphemism. I saw one unit where it was obvious that some activity was being carried on since a pipe was emitting steam. It was equally obvious from the shattered walls, windows, and roofs of most of the textile sheds that the bulk of the plant had been abandoned. The silk mill had been destroyed, and no pretense was made that it was still working. The thread cooperative had been devastated, along with half of the buildings on the street where it stood. After my dispatches began appearing in the Times, Arthur Sylvester, then the chief spokesman for the Pentagon, urged that I walk down the main street of Nam Dinh, where, he said, I would find a large anti-aircraft installation. I only wished I could have taken him with me on the stroll. My car had passed down the main street and turned at an intersection. No anti-aircraft installation was in sight that day, nor was one in sight on New Year's Day when some other visitors were in Nam Dinh. The nearest thing to a military installation which I saw on Nam Dinh's main street was a rather pretty militia woman or traffic officer. She had a small revolver on her hip, but I doubted that it would have been effective against a supersonic attack bomber. We drove about Nam Dinh through the textile area and stopped in Silk Street. For blocks and blocks I could see nothing but desolation. Residential housing, stores, all the buildings were destroyed, damaged, or abandoned. I felt that I was walking through a city of a vanished civilization. Here and there, a handful of young men and women were at work, patiently pulling down lumber from broken houses and neatly stacking it. Many of the streets were so devastated that no one could live in them. Others had simply been abandoned in the wholesale evacuation. It was not only the city of Nam Dinh which had been severely damaged. The area of destruction continued outside the city. We drove out along the Dow River dike and came upon a band of 1,000 or more young men and women constructing a great supplementary dike to hold back the waters of the Dow from Nam Dinh. This construction work had been undertaken, the officials said, because of repeated American attacks on the Dow dike system. The danger to the city from such attacks was extreme. The whole of Nam Dinh is 6, 8, or even 14 feet below water level during the rainy season. A breach of the levees would destroy the community. As I walked through Silk Street and saw the battered tower of the cathedral with its strings of red pennants and its white star of Bethlehem mounted for Christmas, looking out over a sea of destruction, I could not help but think of other scenes of wartime desolation, the earliest of which I had seen as a child in the London Illustrated News and the midweek Pictorial. The shattered walls of Ypres and Reims, the gaping craters that I walked past every London morning between Park Lane and North Audley Street, the chasms where workers' apartments once stood around Leningrad's Narva gates, the Evangelical Church on Berlin's Kurfürstendamm, which might serve as a memorial of all war's desolation for all time. Now it had happened to another city, a remote city in a remote country, a city whose name meant nothing to practically anyone in the whole of the United States, a city so obscure that we would have to hunt for it on the map of a country whose name most of us could not pronounce. What earthly meaning could be extracted from this destruction? What military purpose was it serving? It was hard to comprehend as I sat in the air raid shelter outside the Nam Dinh municipal headquarters talking with the mayor, a woman whose petite figure suggested an age much closer to 20 than 40. Hardly had we gotten back from looking at the Dow River levees than the air alert sounded. We went to the bunker and sat there looking out at the sunshine which had just succeeded the day-long clouds. A great deal of Nam Dinh, said the mayor, had disappeared, probably 13% of the city's housing, residences for 12,464 people. Casualties had been, considering everything, remarkably low, only 89 killed and 405 wounded, she said. But of course, she added, 80% of the city's population had been evacuated. Why had Nam Dinh been attacked so heavily and so often? The Americans think they can touch our hearts, said Nguyen Dinh Khan, meaning that the Americans thought they could intimidate the population. It was his belief that by a silent, unannounced assault on Nam Dinh, the United States was seeking to give North Vietnam an object lesson. This is what we can do to Hanoi if we wish. That was supposed to be the moral. So the officials of Nam Dinh thought. There was no way for me to know whether their belief had any justification. All I knew was that Nam Dinh had taken a remarkable weight of high explosive and steel. I wondered as I sat in this shelter waiting for the all clear, which finally sounded at 2:47 p.m., whether there might be some vital military objective in Nam Dinh which was not visible to my eye, some secret installation which we were relentlessly trying to destroy or cripple. It seemed unlikely, but the whole story of Nam Dinh had a quality of unreality, like some terrible dream in a Dada painting. One could almost imagine our bombers coming again and again and again, attacking and attacking, trying to hit some phantom which ever eluded them because it never had existed. I put my thoughts down on paper when I returned to Hanoi on Christmas evening and sent a dispatch off to the New York Times which shocked the Pentagon and produced a rash of denials, assaults on my personal reliability, and hastily fabricated explanations. But after all the statements and all the verbal brickbats had been hurled, the mystery of Nam Dinh remained. For even by the Pentagon's least strict definition, there were no very remarkable targets in Nam Dinh. True, materials going south passed through the city. True, there was a railroad, a small freight yard, an area along the river where boat and barge cargo was sorted out and reshipped, but it didn't amount to much. This, I was to come to find, was one of the tragedies of the Vietnam War, and perhaps the fatal fallacy in our whole bombing policy. When you totaled all the military objectives in North Vietnam, they didn't total very much. The best of them, from the military standpoint, were roads and railroads. We were hitting these with a tremendous amount of muscle, but the stuff still went through. North Vietnam was paying a tragic price in order that the architects of our bombing policy might prove its validity. But I wondered whether, in the end, the heaviest price might not be that paid by us Americans for our stubborn pursuit of a military theory which seemed to have little connection with reality. Would we not in the end suffer more deeply for permitting this folly to continue than the poor, battered, destitute people and their habitations upon which we insisted on imposing the grandiose title of military objective? I strongly suspected, before I arrived in Hanoi, that the North Vietnamese authorities would not have taken what was for them the giant step of authorizing my visa unless they had decided that the time had come for active exploration of the possibility of peace by negotiation in Southeast Asia. I departed from Hanoi with that suspicion transformed into positive conviction. No other sensible interpretation could be placed on the conversations which I had with the Premier and other North Vietnamese officials. What had produced this attitude in Hanoi? Obviously, I had not found that our bombing had achieved this result. I thought that a circumstance far more dangerous to Hanoi and quite probably to the world lay in the background of the changed thinking. That circumstance was the chaos in China. Here in Hanoi, one felt the hot breath of the Peking crisis like a fiery draft from a suddenly opened furnace. The events in China were like some terrible charade. Everyone's attention was riveted on them. Everyone knew the fateful consequences that might flow from them, but no one knew how to influence them. The brooding quarrel between the Soviet Union and China had boiled over. The consequences already were disastrous for the orderly conduct of North Vietnam's defense. Month by month and week by week, the problem grew more grave. North Vietnam was spending more effort now trying to maintain relations with its two great neighbors, trying to keep the flow of supplies coming through, than on any other aspect of the war, and the possibility daily heightened that graver disaster lay ahead. China could at any moment erupt into civil war. It was possible the Chinese would try to confront Ho with a fait accompli and subvert his government if they thought he was beginning to side with the Soviet Union. In their present hysteria, almost any act of Hanoi's could be interpreted in Peking as hostile to China or pro-Soviet. I returned from Hanoi convinced that a settlement of the Vietnam War by negotiation lay within our grasp. I was convinced that it would not be easy to negotiate, and I was by no means convinced that we were prepared to understand or undertake this difficult and complex task. As I understood our objectives in Southeast Asia, they comprised the following. We had no desire to overthrow the communist regime of North Vietnam. We accepted the continuance of Ho and his successors in that country. We had no territorial aspirations in Vietnam, and none in Southeast Asia. We had no desire to remain in South Vietnam or any part of Vietnam. So far as the public record went, the chief difficulty concerned the future status and regime of South Vietnam. The problem centered on Hanoi's support of the front as the appropriate spokesman for the South. We did not recognize the front, although we had said cryptically that there would be no difficulty about a place for the front at the negotiating table. Was there room for maneuver on this point? I suspected there was, although I did not expect the front or Hanoi to put this on public record or even to agree to it in the first round of private discussion. But both sides had publicly agreed that they would back a coalition government. The problem here was balance. Who would have the majority? Was there some non-aligned or moderate figure around whom a coalition government might be constructed? I believed that the vital ingredients of the Liberation Front program, at least as described in Hanoi, a mixed economy, free rights for all parties, neutral foreign policy, no alliances, would permit construction of such a government. Its stability could be ensured by the United States economic aid, guarantees by Asian powers, and the great powers, guarantees by Hanoi. There was an armory of factors which could be utilized to give the structure strength if it possessed the vital ingredient of political virility. It was an unequaled opportunity for the United States, one which might not recur and which might slip away in certain eventualities, such as the reduction of political tensions in Peking or a rapprochement between Peking and Moscow, both of which might occur. We were now at a striking point in history in Southeast Asia. Hanoi had not been defeated. The United States had not been defeated. Each was conscious of the strength of the other. Each had suffered, but not irretrievably. We could, therefore, if we utilized our instincts for statesmanship, construct a settlement which would have the elements of equity, honor, and reasonableness, and which might endure. The task of negotiating a durable Southeast Asian settlement was a fascinating one, the kind to evoke a challenge to any diplomat, the kind which would be a monument to the statesmanship of the man who accomplished it, something far beyond the transient triviality of so many post-war diplomatic settlements. This could be the foundation for a whole new epoch in Asia, one which would contribute to the strength and stability of a world which would endure whatever passing crises might come to China or even to India. Was it true that we could not find a way to live with China? Must the globe be turned into a poisonous desert because of China? I did not believe so. Surely America's heritage, Yankee ingenuity, and the democratic imagination of our great people could devise a better course.